In the late 1930s, Clive Staples Lewis and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien decided that they were each going to write a novel. They were going to write in a genre that was generally ignored within literary circles, but where they, as professors of English language and literature at Oxford, saw the opportunity to recreate a sense of otherworldly wonder that they felt was missing in modern literature. That genre, of course, was science fiction. This was a term formerly coined in 1916, though you can find examples going back quite a bit further. Tolkien and Lewis were both fans of foundational works of the genre, like the books of H.G. Wells, but when it came to the contemporary stuff that was being published in pulp science fiction magazines, well, they felt that they could do better. So they flipped a coin to decide that Tolkien would write a time travel story, while Lewis would write a space travel story. Now, for Tolkien, a problem soon emerged, being that he was a serial procrastinator. He started on a book called The Lost Road, featuring a modern man experiencing visions of his past lives going back to ancient Atlantis. But then he left this hanging to focus on writing a sequel to his earlier children's book, The Hobbit. Then he put that on pause to focus on reworking The Lost Road into an even more convoluted time travel story called The Notion Club Papers. Then he gave that up as well, and decided to just incorporate this idea of Lost Atlantis, referred to by its true name of Numenor, into his Hobbit sequel, which finally got published in the 1950s. In the meantime, C.S. Lewis came out with his space travel book, Out of the Silent Planet, in 1938. He then followed it up with 2 sequels, and then he began pumping out his own fantasy series while Tolkien was still finishing up The Lord of the Rings. And today, everyone knows Lewis as the Narnia guy, but, well, you've seen the title of this video. I think the Space Trilogy is one of the most distinctive and unusual works of science fiction in the entire 20th century. Lewis himself described it as being less a gratification of his interest in the genre and more an exorcism of it. There is a lot to unpack there. My original plan was to make a single video covering the whole trilogy, but each book is really its own standalone story that has a lot going on in it, so today we'll just focus on the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, and then I'll get around to talking about the rest of the trilogy at some point eventually. Oh, and before we begin, there's the obligatory warning that this video will contain spoilers for James Cameron's Avatar. Elwyn Ransom is a professor of philology at a prominent British university. He is altogether a rather modest, pious person who takes pleasure in the simpler things in life. Part of the book's framing device is that Lewis supposedly knows him in real life and is relaying the story on his behalf. The name Elwyn Ransom is just a pseudonym to maintain his anonymity. A lot of people interpret this book as a sort of friend fiction, with Ransom as a stand-in for Tolkien. Within his letters, Lewis does imply that this was his intention, though Tolkien himself wrote that he saw no substantive similarities between himself and Ransom, so make of that what you will. In any case, Ransom is not the type of person who would, by his own volition, end up in outer space. He starts off the story on vacation, walking cross-country. But it is getting late, and there is nowhere nearby that's offering accommodation. However, he learns that there is a manor nearby, where a couple of mysterious gentlemen are staying. They are working on a project that demands the utmost secrecy. They won't let anyone in other than a local boy to perform manual labor, but tonight he still hasn't returned home, and his mother is getting worried. Ransom figures that he can do a good deed by sorting this whole thing out, and then, once he's among some men of equivalent social standing, well, he might be able to finesse his way into staying a night at the country house. There's no one around to let him in, so he engages in a bit of light trespassing. He finds the missing boy being forcefully restrained by the manor's inhabitants. It turns out that these two men are a renowned physicist named Dr. Weston and a businessman named Mr. Devine. It's an awkward situation, but once everyone's all properly introduced, they explain that the boy was just having a fit, and they were restraining him for his own protection. They let him go, and then they insist that a gentleman and a scholar like Ransom must simply stay the night with them. Ransom sits down, he has some drinks, and then, right when he's in the middle of talking to Devine, telling him how liberating it is to be on a months-long vacation in the countryside, with no one out there keeping track of his whereabouts, he begins to lose consciousness. When he wakes up, he is in outer space. He is in a spherical spaceship with Weston and Devine. They are on their way to the planet Mars, or rather, they keep referring to it as Malacandra, which is its native name. They know that because they've been there before. They met aliens, and now they're coming back, and they're bringing Ransom with them. This is a lot to take in. But the journey to Malacandra is going to take about a month, so he has plenty of time to process it. There's no real way he can try to escape or fight back when these are the only two people who know how to pilot the device that's separating him from the vacuum of space, so he's just kind of gotta hang out with them. Now, I've mentioned before that C.S. Lewis was a big fan of H.G. Wells, and one of the most formative books he read when he was growing up was The First Men in the Moon. This is, incidentally, the story of a physicist and a businessman who team up to build a spherical flying machine in the English countryside, which they then take up into outer space. But the way that Lewis makes things play out, it feels less like a direct copy of Wells and more like a response. Weston is a clear parallel to Caver, the genius scientist behind the spaceship. But he's also a much more sinister figure. He's cold and arrogant, and he likes to go off on rants about how his work in Malacandra is essential to safeguarding the future of humanity, and how he would be perfectly justified in killing 1 million people in order to achieve it. This does not boost Ransom's confidence that he's going to make it out of this unscathed. Devine, meanwhile, is a clear parallel to Bedford. He's a businessman who's financing the whole operation, thinking that this whole space travel enterprise will be very profitable once it gets off the ground. He's much more personable than Weston, but there's something hollow about it all. Whereas Weston has these grand ideals about the future of humanity, Devine just seems like he wants to get rich so he can have a yacht and a holiday home and the attention of beautiful women, and when it comes to achieving that goal, he is utterly ruthless, with no moral scruples holding him back. Ransom has to make do being stuck with these two for about a month. But then they begin to approach Malacandra, and hold on a minute, what's the best way to visualize this? Yep, that'll work. It is a cold and desolate planet, but its landscape is also dotted with fertile valleys, which 1800s astronomers had observed and labeled as canals. The conditions are relatively comfortable for human habitation. Weston and Devine have already set up a hut during their previous visit. Once they've transferred all of their supplies out of the spaceship, it is time to carry out the plan. They pull out their pistols and start escorting Ransom to a third location. At this point, they've begun casually referring to him as a sacrifice, which really doesn't indicate that anything good is going to happen. But he is seemingly saved when a monstrous creature emerges from the water and lunges towards them. Weston and Divine are distracted, so he makes a run for it. He's managed to escape, but now he is alone and lost on an alien planet. Lewis doesn't set up Ransom as a typical pulp action hero. He possesses little physical courage, and he mostly spends his time confused, scared, and in desperate need of food and water. But throughout it all, he can't help but appreciate that there's something beautiful about this alien world of pink and purple vegetation, its bizarre animals, its strange smells. And then, he makes contact with intelligent life. When he stops by a river to drink, a creature emerges, a humanoid figure covered in sleek black fur, looking something like an anthropomorphic otter or a seal. Ransom is apprehensive. Weston and Divine were just about to offer him as a sacrifice, and it logically follows from this that the Malacandrans are in the market for human sacrifice. But then, it begins to talk. It is an incomprehensible alien language, but that's exactly what excites Ransom's interest. He is an academic philologist, after all, and the opportunity to be the first human to decode an alien language, well, that's something that he would risk anything for. Neither dared let the other approach, yet each repeatedly felt the impulse to do so himself and yielded to it. It was foolish, frightening, ecstatic, and unbearable all in one moment. It was more than curiosity. It was like courtship, like the meeting of the first man and the first woman in the world. It was like something beyond that. So natural is the contact of the sexes, so limited the strangeness, so shallow the reticence, so mild the repugnance to be overcome, compared with the first tingling intercourse of two different but rational species. It turns out that this thing is named Hyoy, and he is a Hross, and they live in a village as Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Ransom's expectations for an alien society are mostly based around the type of monsters that appear in science fiction stories. He even thinks specifically of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells, so he's surprised that the Hrossa are really quite nice. Almost too nice. As he picks up their language, he finds that they lack any words for concepts like theft, war, or oppression. They don't even have a word for bad or evil. The nearest equivalent seems to be bent. It is incomprehensible to them that any person would knowingly cause harm to another person, or would ever try to take more resources than they need to survive. The Hrossa work for subsistence, and they're content to spend their free time making poetry and enjoying the company of friends and family. They have no idea what a human is. This specific village evidently didn't have contact with Weston or Divine, but they also don't consider the existence of a new race from the stars to be particularly shocking. There are multiple intelligent species, or to use their term, Hnau, that live on Malacandra. The Fiffletriggi are these rather frog-like creatures that typically take the role of craftsmen and artisans. They feel very reminiscent of the dwarves in Tolkien's Legendarium, in which case the elves would be the Saroni, these pale, thin, giant figures who serve as the intellectual and philosopher class. Relations between the three species are entirely peaceful. In fact, there is a kind of perfect symbiosis. There's this whole explanation about how interacting with different species who are equally intelligent but distinct in their physiology and mannerisms seems to fulfill this deep psychological need, and humans being all alone on Earth are, in a way, incomplete. C.S. Lewis, throughout all of his writings, shows a fascination with the concept of anthropomorphized animals, so it seems that he spent quite a bit of time thinking about this. But all of that just seems kind of suspicious to Ransom. It can't be that simple. There's gotta be a dark secret behind it all. After all, Weston and Devine have to have gotten the idea of sacrificing him from somewhere. He hears mention of Oyarsa, who's apparently the supreme authority on Malacandra, and he figures there might be something fishy going on there, if nowhere else. But in the meantime, he's managed to ingratiate himself with the Hrassa pretty well. After a few weeks, Huey invites him to take part in the highest honor in their culture, to go on a hunt for a Hnakra. This is the most fearsome creature in all of Malacandra. It is a pitched battle, but it ends with Huey climbing onto its head and throwing a spear directly into its mouth. The two of them embrace in celebration. Within these few weeks, Ransom really seems to have become one with the Hrassa, and within that time, he's nearly forgotten all about Weston and Devine. At that moment, Ransom was deafened by a loud sound, a perfectly familiar sound, which was the last thing he expected to hear. It was a terrestrial, human, and civilized sound. It was even European. It was the crack of an English rifle, and Huey, at his feet, was struggling to rise and gasping. "Huey, can you hear me?" said Ransom, with his face close to the round, seal-like head. "Huey, it is through me that this has happened. It is the other Humana who have hit you, the Bentu that brought me to Malacandra. They can throw death at a distance with the thing they have made. I should have told you. We are all a bent race. We have come here to bring evil on Malacandra. We are only half now, Huey." It should be pretty clear at this point how C.S. Lewis was trying to subvert the typical tropes of science fiction. He read a lot of stories about these intrepid human explorers going to other worlds and running into these monstrous aliens, only to defeat them in a show of the indomitable human spirit. And he absolutely hated this. To him, this was just a naked celebration of imperial violence. He actually became quite worried about it becoming a reality. He wrote a whole essay advocating against space exploration on these grounds. "We know what our race does to strangers. Man destroys or enslaves every species he can. Civilized man murders, enslaves, cheats, and corrupts savage man. Even inanimate nature he turns into dust bowls and slag heaps. I therefore fear the practical, not the theoretical problems which will arise if we ever meet rational creatures which are not human. Against them we shall, if we can, commit all the crimes we have already committed against creatures certainly human but differing from us in features and pigmentation, and the starry heavens will become an object to which good men can look up only with feelings of intolerable guilt, agonized pity, and burning shame." James Cameron's Avatar is set on the world of Pandora, a moon orbiting the planet Polyphemus in the Alpha Centauri system. Here, the Resource Development Administration, or RDA, is engaged in a struggle with the native population, the Na'vi, and bear with me, I swear this is going somewhere. So, Out of the Silent Planet is a very early example of the type of subversive science fiction you'd see decades later with books like Michael Moorcock's The Eternal Champion, or Ursula K. Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest. This contrast between the cruel, greedy, short-sighted humans against the perfect, wholesome, progressive aliens has then been repeated again and again, until what started off as something bold and subversive has become a bit of a cliché in itself. To a lot of people, these stories just feel preachy, guilt-tripping, one-dimensional. But Out of the Silent Planet, well, you could still actually accuse it of being all of those things as well, but it goes in a rather different direction than you'd probably expect. And as a point of reference, we can use what is probably the most striking Actually, the most striking example would have to be the Human Domestication Guide, but the one that most well-adjusted people will be familiar with is James Cameron's Avatar. And I will admit, I am not exactly breaking new ground here. Avatar is a movie that's been analyzed and critiqued to death. I know I'm kind of beating a dead dire horse here, but bear with me, I do think that comparing it specifically to Out of the Silent Planet, there might be some angles you haven't considered before. You could analyze a story at multiple levels, so let's start out with the most literal perspective. Let's say, look at the world building. Pandora is a world with its own unique ecosystem. If you read the supplementary material that was released around the film, you'll be surprised by just how much thought was put into the biology of all of the flora and fauna, and how everything actually could have evolved realistically. It's not the hardest science fiction out there, but it has a lot more depth than you'd usually expect from a Hollywood action blockbuster. But then we get to the Na'vi. They just look out of place in this world. Everything else has 6 legs and 4 eyes and no hair and is generally quite alien. But them, they're just people. Blue, tall, but people. And their culture is also pretty recognizably human, but, well, better, more egalitarian, more communitarian, more in touch with nature. Their entire value system is based around reverence for the All-Mother Awa, who is set up as this all-pervading spiritual force, the god of Pandora. But it seems like James Cameron was a bit embarrassed about including magic in a science fiction film, so he tries to set up a naturalistic explanation. Awa is a distributed consciousness which resides within the root system of these creepy bioluminescent trees, which connect to each other like the neurons of a brain. She is the personification of the whole biosphere, able to regulate the planet at will. As we're told regarding Pandora in James Cameron's Avatar, an activist survival guide, population of all life forms is kept in perfect dynamic equilibrium, with an organic and natural symmetry that makes concepts like overpopulation, poverty, or homelessness unintelligible. The whole point of this type of story is that it sets up a cosmology where there's this absolute moral standard of the universe, which humanity has fallen short of. We can all look around at the violence and war and oppression on Earth and feel that something has gone wrong, that any other intelligent species would be faring much better than this, and they would look down upon us in judgment. In Avatar, the basis for this moral standard is to be found in nature, where everything is supposedly peaceful and harmonious, until humanity came along as the exception to this rule, a disruptive force, ruining everything with our greed and selfishness and disrespect for the natural order. You've probably seen people say things like, man is the cruelest animal, human nature is inherently evil, or, more recently, humanity is the real virus. And this is often taken as something deep and meaningful, but, well, if you actually take this viewpoint seriously, then there's quite a few challenges that emerge. You just need to look at the animal world and see that it's not exactly teeming with peace, equality, or respect for the sanctity of life. If we accept that the standard for moral conduct is to be found in nature, well, it'll be a bit less kumbaya than what we see in Avatar. These standards of right and wrong are very meaningful to us humans. It's why we're always flagellating ourselves for failing to live up to them. But outside of humanity, they don't have much meaning at all. Even the idea that the natural environment is important and should be protected doesn't really have a basis in nature itself. You might have a romantic ideal of the pristine earth before humans came and mucked everything up, but you could just as easily talk about a pristine sky before birds came along and mucked it up, or a pristine environment of microorganisms back 2.5 billion years ago, before some jagweed decided to evolve photosynthesis and flood the atmosphere with oxygen. Something like anthropogenic climate change is certainly a bad thing if, say, you have an interest in the city of Miami remaining above water, or if you, for whatever reason, have a bias against the yellow fever virus. But from the standpoint of Mother Earth, it's just another mass extinction event. She's had them before. A lot of species will go away, but the remainder will adapt and fill in new niches. Many of us have an intuitive feeling that there's something wrong with the state of humanity. With all the war and the genocide and the environmental destruction, it seems to all go against some natural law. But if you're looking at it from purely a scientific, materialist viewpoint, then there's nothing inherent in the universe saying that peace, tolerance, and sustainability are necessarily good things. These are values that only exist in our own minds. They are the result of our evolution as a social species, while the greed and aggression and selfishness that stop us from fully realizing these ideals are likewise natural instincts meant to help us survive as individuals. There is one quote, which I was pretty sure came from Carl Sagan, that goes, "I believe in a universe that doesn't care, and people that do." But I'm looking it up now, and it's actually from the video game Night in the Woods, written by Bethany Hockenberry and Scott Benson. But in any case, it does seem rather apt. If there are aliens out there, you might easily imagine that coming from a completely different evolutionary background, they would end up with incompatible moral values, that we would find each other mutually repulsive. This is part of the premise of the Selenites in H.G. Wells's First Men in the Moon. Alternatively, you might imagine that there's a tendency towards convergent evolution, that any intelligent species would end up with similar drives and similar motives as us. They would have the same lofty ideals, but they would also suffer from the same base instincts that stop them from being fully realized. This is a major theme in another science fiction series from the same time period, The Mythos of Olaf Stapleton, which I've made a whole other video about. But to imagine that our moral ideal is in fact the universal default, that any other species would not only follow the same precepts as us, but in fact would do it better than us, without suffering from any of the drives or temptations that we consider to be immoral? Well, speaking from a purely scientific, materialist viewpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it can make sense if we get a little help from Jesus. Yeah, we're talking about Jesus. This is C.S. Lewis. I imagine you already knew where this was heading. You might have heard some version of this story before. C.S. Lewis was raised in the Church of England, but by the time he was a teenager, he was struck by that disconnect between what things are and what they ought to be. There's no way that a world that's so unjust could be the creation of a benevolent God. He became an atheist. But then, some years later, he realized a contradiction, the same problem that we identified with Avatar. In a materialistic world, there's no objective standard by which the universe could be judged as just or unjust. He might have certain subjective preferences for kindness over cruelty, bravery over cowardice, beauty over ugliness, but those would just be preferences. He lacked any basis to hold them up as objective moral judgments, and he did not have such a blithe attitude towards this as Angus from Night in the Woods. To him, this was simply unacceptable. Right is right, wrong is wrong. If science can't acknowledge that, then there must be something beyond science. He noticed that religions and philosophies across the world tend to have very similar moral precepts, and myths that follow very similar structures. He took this to mean that all of them represent part of some eternal truth. After careful consideration, he decided that the two religions which seemed most mature, which seemed that they had reached closest to this truth, were Hinduism and Christianity. Influenced by friends like J.R.R. Tolkien, he settled on Christianity, and from there, it turns out that the zeal of the convert is an expression that exists for a reason, because he took it up with, well, it got to the point where even Tolkien felt it was getting a bit much. Christianity became the central theme of pretty much his entire creative output, and that definitely extends to the Space Trilogy. After Huey is murdered, Ransom is told that he must take a journey to Meldorn and speak with Oyarsa, the supreme authority of Malacandra. It's a long journey. He narrowly manages to survive the thin air of the Highlands. He makes some friends among the Saroni and the Fifiltrigi, and he gets to Meldorn, which turns out to be a great hill, on top of which is a grove of trees, and within that grove he can commune with Oyarsa, who is a disembodied spirit who governs the affairs of Malacandra, not entirely unlike Awa on Pandora. But Oyarsa is most assuredly not the god of Malacandra. There is only one true god, who in the solar tongue is called Meleldil. He put an Oyarsa in charge of every planet, and in the beginning, all was good. There was no cruelty or injustice. Everything was perfectly ordered according to divine will. But then, everything changed when the Oyarsa of Earth became bent, and he waged war against the rest of the solar system. The moon was rendered barren and lifeless, and so were the highlands of Malacandra. But eventually, the forces of Meleldil gained the upper hand, and they sealed the Bent One within the atmosphere of his planet. From there on, it has been known as Thulkandra, the Silent Planet. Not even the Oresu know what goes on there, though they can speculate. We think that Meleldil would not give it up utterly to the Bent One, and there are stories among us that he has taken strange counsel and dared terrible things wrestling with the Bent One in Thulkandra. This is C.S. Lewis's one-sentence summary of the Bible. Originally, humanity was without sin, just like the people of Malacandra. But then there was the fall. Humanity gave in to the temptation of the Bent One, and motivated by pride, chose of its own free will to disobey the will of Meleldil. So the entire species became bent, and Thulkandra became an island of sin and pain within an otherwise immaculate cosmos. As far as C.S. Lewis is concerned, Out of the Silent Planet is a perfectly plausible work of science fiction. Christian doctrine gives no stance one way or the other about life on other planets, so Lewis felt we should be open to anything. If you remember that essay he wrote against space exploration, it was called Religion and Rocketry. He posits that the rest of the universe may very well be inhabited by unfallen species, if we accept that all life, by default, is without sin and obedient to the will of God, then it becomes very plausible that we are the sole exception, the uniquely wretched race which can only bring evil to the rest of the cosmos. It's a premise that was very awkward when we looked at it from a secular perspective, like in Avatar, but it makes perfect sense within a Christian worldview, though I'm willing to bet that, for a lot of you, there's something counterintuitive about this. To unpack that, we need to look at things from another angle. If you think back to those old pulp stories about intrepid human explorers versus savage aliens, you might pick up on some subtext. The humans are never representative of humanity as a whole. For whatever reason, it's only white Anglo-Saxon men who make it into space. And the aliens aren't necessarily these totally unique, unearthly beings. They're often given traits associated with human groups that the author considers to be savage and exotic. Sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes very intentionally, these stories come off as a celebration of European imperialism. And that's precisely what's being reacted against in stories like Out of the Silent Planet or Avatar. So here we have something that starts out from the same premise, that the humans in the story, the people with whom the audience is naturally supposed to identify, are the colonizers, while the aliens, the them, the outgroup, are a stand-in for indigenous peoples. But instead of cheering for the conquering humans, we're meant to feel guilt, to see this as a tragedy, as a crime. And again, the whole conceit isn't just that the aliens are worthy of moral consideration, but that they are, in fact, morally superior to humans. In Avatar, we're supposed to see the Na'vi as specifically a stand-in for the native peoples of North America. As James Cameron himself put it, it's not meant to be subtle. So the story plays into a very specific narrative of the pre-Columbian continent as this pure society, where everyone lived in peace and harmony with nature before the Europeans came in and brought war and greed and environmental destruction for the very first time. You probably don't need me to talk at length about how this narrative is rather condescending. If you actually look into the Americas pre-contact, then you'll find that this was not a place that was free of war, oppression, or changes to the natural environment. These were civilizations, and they were just as complex and just as messy as any society in the Old World. Now, you could definitely make the case that most New World cultures were far less stratified compared to the feudal kingdoms of Europe, or that their approach to resource management put a much larger emphasis on sustainability, but you would have to caveat this with a lot of nuances that just aren't present in Avatar. The film cares very little for the actual values and practices of any actual native culture. Instead, it just uses the surface-level aesthetics to create this generic archetype of what someone like James Cameron imagines when he thinks of a primitive, idyllic, in-touch-with-nature society. The Na'vi basically serve as a wish-fulfillment fantasy, as we project ourselves onto Jake Sully and watch him as he becomes maybe the most straightforward example of a white savior in modern media. And usually, whenever this topic comes up, it spirals into some discussion over whether we should cancel James Cameron, and I'll let you have whatever opinion you want there. Each of these movies makes like $1 billion. I don't think people on the internet getting mad about it's gonna make much of a dent. I'm just saying, at the very least, if we're accepting that colonialism is the main theme of Avatar, then we also have to admit that it's handled, at best, rather clumsily. So, How does Out of the Silent Planet compare? Now, again, it probably feels rather strange for a story like this to be told from a Christian perspective, if only because of all the political alignments involved. Anti-imperialism, sympathy for those who are considered other, these are things that we associate with the political left, which for various historical reasons we also associate with a more agnostic attitude towards religion. Fervent Christianity is the domain of the political right, along with nationalism and intense in-group bias. These are the people who were irate when Avatar was first released, who couldn't believe that James Cameron would expect the audience to root for a bunch of savage tree people against the brave US Marines. Debbie Schlussel gives it a score of 4 Marxes plus an Obama. A book like Out of the Silent Planet really only could have come from someone like C.S. Lewis. Now, he was definitely a political conservative. That will become a lot more apparent in the next 2 books of the trilogy. But he also had a very particular vision of conservatism, of people living peacefully in small villages in line with traditional Christian values. And this vision doesn't leave a lot of room for sending soldiers off to distant lands to subjugate foreign peoples and steal their stuff. He did not have positive feelings towards imperialism, but for his critique, he follows a different structure from what we see in Avatar. The Hrassa play into a lot of those noble savage stereotypes, but they aren't really reminiscent of any specific indigenous group in the same way that the Na'vi are obviously supposed to be Native Americans. After all, the whole thing about the Malacandrans is that they are unfallen, and this isn't something that C.S. Lewis thought was true of any extant group of humans. They can't really be interpreted as a straightforward allegory for any real-world victims of imperialism, so instead they serve as a device to make a statement about the perpetrators of imperialism. I mentioned before that any actual human society will be, well, complicated and messy, and the apologists of imperialism love to use this as a talking point. They'll point to all of this and say, see, the natives weren't pure and perfect like James Cameron wants you to believe. Clearly, European imperialism was a humanitarian project to wipe away these savage practices and uplift these poor, misguided people to a higher level of civilization. But C.S. Lewis saw that this is nonsense. People like Hernan Cortés or Cecil Rhodes did not have a single humanitarian bone in their entire body. They were out to subjugate people and steal their stuff. Everything else was just an ex post facto justification. They would have done the exact same thing even if the natives were a pure, innocent, Edenic society. So, in Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis sets up a hypothetical situation to demonstrate exactly that. And I guess you could also argue that Avatar accomplishes the same thing. But let's be honest, Selfridge and Quaritch aren't characters that have nearly enough depth for us to really learn anything about them via their actions in the story. On the other hand, Lewis is very interested in the psychology of Divine and Weston, the self-serving capitalist and the social Darwinist ideologue. There's not a whole lot of natural affinity between them, but their interests coincided. Weston had the skill and the knowledge, Divine had the cash. Together, they could make it into space. As Oyarsa tells Ransom, the two of them first came to Malacandra a couple years ago. They set up a hut and started prospecting for gold, which turned out to be quite plentiful. Oyarsa was naturally curious about this, so he sent a group of Saroni to bring them over so he could talk to them and see what they're all about. But these two, with all their stereotypes about primitive races and far-off lands, they assumed that the Saroni wanted them as human sacrifices. They were reluctant to go, and Oyarsa got fed up with this. As he puts it, though we saw they were stupid, we did not know yet how bent they were. So he sent an ultimatum. They would not be allowed to take any more gold until at least one of them came to Meldorn and talked to him. So they went back in their spaceship and returned to Earth to find a victim. Their first choice was that serving boy in the manor, but then Ransom showed up. Whereas the boy's disappearance at his place of employment would look rather suspicious, no one was keeping track of Ransom during his tramp through the countryside. If he disappeared, no one would be able to trace it back to them. Now, Weston did have some misgivings. A professor like Ransom is much more eugenically valuable to society than some bumpkin country boy, so it seemed a bit of a waste to have him sacrificed. But Divine talked him into it, and so they spiked his drink, brought him to Malacandra, and set up this whole chain of events, ending with them being brought to Oyarsa for judgment. Divine, the businessman, had only taken part in this whole enterprise for gold. While things were looking up, he stood out for being quite brash and sarcastic. But now that it's all gone awry, he's gone uncharacteristically quiet. He figures that acting supplicant is the best way to save his skin. According to Oyarsa, it's not really accurate to consider him bent so much as he is broken. He's managed to completely sever any connection he once had to moral law. His only concern is to satisfy his own greed. He doesn't care how much damage he causes in pursuit of that goal. He shouldn't even be considered a proper Hnau, a sapient being worthy of moral consideration, so much as he is a particularly clever animal. Oyarsa states that if Divine was under his dominion, he would simply unbody him. But while Divine begs for mercy, it's a different story with Weston, the professor. When he first encounters Oyarsa, this disembodied angelic voice, he refuses to consider that there could be anything in the universe beyond his understanding. He writes it off as ventriloquism, some witch doctor's trick. He's so obviously superior to these primitives that it should be easy to scare them into submission by appealing to their superstition. You let us go, then we talkie. You think we know power? Think you do all you like? You no can. Great big headman in the sky? He send us. You no do what I say? He come. Blow you all up. Poof! Bang! This does not have the intended effect, and Weston realizes that he may have reached the end of his rope. But still, he doesn't ask for mercy. He stands by his convictions. Now, I guess the best way to describe Weston's beliefs is he's basically Elon Musk. Or more specifically, he's the version of Elon Musk back in the 2010s, when he was always talking about how humanity needs to spread to other planets for its long-term survival, as opposed to the Elon Musk of today, who mostly just seems to jerk off to AI images. Weston sees that traditional morality has no basis in objective science. It is just pure sentimentality. To him, the only thing that matters is the survival and advancement of the human race. Earth won't be habitable forever, so humanity needs to spread to Malacandra, and then Malacandra won't last forever, so it needs to keep going further and further. If it means wiping out the native species, then that is justified, just as it is always justified for a higher race to supersede a lower race. As far as Oyarsa, and by extension C.S. Lewis is concerned, Weston is far more dangerous than Divine. People like Divine, the people who know what they're doing is wrong, but they do it anyway for some personal benefit, they've existed all throughout history. But Weston is a distinctively modern phenomenon. Lewis was quite concerned about this new creed, and he wrote about it in his nonfiction works as well. He used a few different terms for it. One of them was Wellesianity, for the author he believed played a disproportionate role in popularizing it. but the terms he preferred were developmentalism or evolutionism. Now, to be clear, Lewis didn't have any objections to the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection. In one of his main works of apologetics, The Problem of Pain, he spends a surprisingly large amount of the book reimagining the events of Genesis to align with a more modern understanding of natural history. His concern was when people went beyond using evolution as a scientific theory and tried to apply it as an ethical framework. To say that Christian morality is obsolete, and the only thing that matters is survival and expansion, to become more developed, more evolved. When it looks like it's all over, Weston gives one final speech. He talks in English while Ransom translates it into the Hrossa language. This is probably one of the most iconic moments in the book. On the Wikipedia page for Out of the Silent Planet, they've got both versions of the speech typed out and compared side by side. The whole joke is that it sounds very grand and epic in English, but it relies on all these abstract concepts that are meaningless on Malacandra, so translated, it ends up being complete nonsense. Weston believes that he's above mere sentimentality, that because his moral system is based around science and evolution, then it is more objective than one based around charity and mercy. But he doesn't realize that by following this logic, the idea that progress is a good thing, even that the long-term survival of humanity is desirable, are themselves equally sentimental fancies. With science alone, you can't prove that any goal is desirable. From C.S. Lewis's perspective, at least, that can only come from the innate moral instincts granted by God. In contrast to Weston's developmentalist philosophy, the Hrossa lack any real technological advancement, but despite it all, they lead lives that are more virtuous, more happy, and if anything, more worthy than that of any human in an industrial society. To use Lewis's own words, "The point I wanted to make is that excessive excitement about gadgetry and the belief, Weston's belief, that the possession of, say, wireless and aeroplanes somehow makes one superior to those who lack them, and even justifies one in conquering such people, is bosh. My motto would be, have your toys, have your conveniences, but for heaven's sake, don't start talking as if those things really mattered, as, say, charity matters." Lewis evidently saw Westonism as one of the most pressing problems facing modern society. So, speaking more concretely, what are some specific examples? With Divine, the self-serving opportunist, you can find countless people meeting that description, but Weston represents a very specific ideology. According to Lewis, this belief system isn't particularly widespread among actual scientists. Weston is portrayed as a physicist, but that's just because the nature of the story required someone to invent the spacecraft. In the real world, he felt that this belief in developmentalism or evolutionism mostly popped up among science enthusiasts, members of the intelligentsia who are excited about scientific progress but don't actually have much technical knowledge, and especially among writers of scientific fiction. Within Lewis's letters, there's several different people he associates with this tendency, but there's a couple of them that seem to come up again and again. One of them is our old friend Olaf Stapleton. It's quite likely that Weston's plans for Malacandra were modeled after the genocide of the Venerians in Stapleton's Last and First Men. Another key figure is J.B.S. Haldane, who was an accomplished biologist as well as a popular science writer who wrote a lot about how he predicted science and technology will shape the future of humanity. According to Lewis, both Stapleton and Haldane were leading us down a path to becoming a race devoted to the increase of its own power by technology, with complete indifference to ethics. And of course, there's the High Prophet of Wellsianity himself. Out of the Silent Planet is set up as a response to H.G. Wells's novel The First Men in the Moon, and based on everything I've said so far, you probably expect this to be some imperialist fantasy about humanity conquering aliens on the moon, but that's not the case at all. Bedford, the businessman who wants to exploit the moon for profit, is portrayed as a buffoon, who quickly finds himself out of his depth once he actually runs into the Selenites. Meanwhile, Caver, the scientist, is motivated by simple curiosity, and he never really shows the grand ambition or ruthlessness of Weston. Within their writings, Wells, Stapleton, and Haldane all grappled with the same dilemma as Lewis, that science can't be a substitute for morality, that ethical values need to come from somewhere else. They all came to their own conclusions that were definitely different from Lewis's, but weren't anything approaching what you might call Westonism. All three of them became socialists and anti-imperialists. They were very concerned about ruthless capitalists like Devine, and while they did believe in the positive potential for scientific progress, they were also very worried about the possibility of a dystopian future where technology becomes a tool of oppression. And the thing is, if Lewis wanted to find people who openly exhibit a Westonian worldview, he definitely could have found them. Even if we're just talking about science fiction authors active at this time, a pretty obvious one would be John W. Campbell. He was, without a doubt, the most influential sci-fi editor in the US, considered to be the architect of the golden age of science fiction. And he was also, well, if you read some of his stories, or any of his editorials, you'll definitely see someone devoted to the increase of power by technology with complete indifference to ethics. Yet, in his letters, when he's talking about the threat of Westonism, Lewis never brings up the likes of Campbell. He always brings it back to this same group of left-wing humanist intellectuals. People who actually agree with him with most of the social criticisms he makes in Out of the Silent Planet, albeit coming at it from a very different angle. There was something about their outlook that deeply bothered him, which he found to be outright dangerous. The character of Weston is his first attempt to articulate that fear, and to be honest, it rather misses the mark. But in the subsequent books of the Space Trilogy, Lewis will keep trying to refine his critique. And whether he actually ends up succeeding, I guess we'll see that in parts 2 and 3. But back to the story at hand, Ransom at this point has lost faith in humanity. He begs Oyarsa to just kill all three of them to put an end to it all. But, as the Archon of Malacandra, Oyarsa feels that he would be overstepping his bounds if he went around unbodying creatures from other planets. He simply orders Devine and Weston to return home. They will have 90 days, after which their spaceship will disintegrate, and their corrupting influence may never return to Malacandra. Ransom is allowed the opportunity to remain, but in the end, he feels a responsibility to return home, so that he might still effect some good against the many evils of Thulcandra. It is a harrowing journey. The change in the relative position of Earth and Mars along their orbits means that it is much longer than their initial trip. But they land just in time, and luckily enough, right in the middle of the English countryside. Weston and Devine abandon Ransom to die, but he wakes up just before the craft disintegrates, and he makes his way to the nearest pub, and so the story concludes. "A pint of bitter, please," said Ransom. Normally, in a piece of media that sets up a utopian world to contrast against our own society, the goal is to inspire us, to create a blueprint for how we can recreate that utopia on Earth. But within the cosmology of Out of the Silent Planet, that is impossible. We are a fallen species. We can't go back. We can't become like the Malacandrans. And again, comparing it to Avatar, we find the same thing. The reason the Na'vi live the way they do is because they're a primitivist society, in a world where everything is kept in balance by a benevolent, globe-spanning superintelligence, and I don't think this is really achievable as a policy agenda. And with Avatar, you could consider this to be another flaw with the movie. Its main theme is environmentalism. It asks us to rethink our society's relationship with the natural world, but it doesn't really give us any clues from how to get from point A to point B. Whereas other sci-fi utopias, like say, the Federation from Star Trek, are actually something we could at least try to strive for, that's much less the case for Pandora, which might dampen the message. But in Out of the Silent Planet, that's kind of the point. From C.S. Lewis's perspective, we can't build heaven on Earth. Heaven is in heaven. Now, he didn't completely dismiss the idea that we should make the world a better place. He definitely would have preferred if the Divines and Westons of the world didn't take over. But as a general rule, he cared less about politics and more about apologetics. In his memoir, he talks a lot about what he calls joy. This is a feeling that, for him at least, is mostly associated with great works of literature, especially myths and romances that harken back to distant times and places. It's a feeling that's deeper than mere aesthetic appreciation. It's more like a longing, a type of nostalgia for something that you haven't actually experienced. It's not entirely a pleasant feeling, but once you've felt it once, you keep wanting more. Lewis concludes that this feeling is ultimately rooted in the desire to escape this fallen world and be one with God. In that way, art can serve as a gateway to salvation, to let in some small piece of that intoxicating joy, that in our desire to get more of it, we will aspire to be something more than our fallen selves, so we can find the ultimate satisfaction for that longing in the only place it can be found, in heaven. When Lewis said that he was trying to exorcise the genre of science fiction, this is what he meant. He wanted to combine the excitement of space travel and alien planets with that deeper, divine sense of joy. I've talked for, frankly, way too long about how this story is constructed at a conceptual level, but the ultimate test to its success is whether it actually succeeds in inspiring that joy within the reader. And that has less to do with the concept and more with the execution, the beauty of the writing, the skill of the imagery, how well he sets up Malacandra as a place that you actually long for. As much as I've critiqued Avatar, this is something that it does very well. Very few people will dispute that it is a visually stunning film, that it sets up Pandora as this utterly enchanting world. There's a whole phenomenon of post-Avatar depression, that it awakened such a deep longing in people that the real world was just unable to compare, which is just about as apt a demonstration of Lewis's concept of joy than I can think of. And whether Malacandra can achieve that feeling just as well as Pandora, well, I guess that's something you'll have to find out for yourself. After reading it a couple times, I'm still as unrepentant of an Epicurean and a Montagnard as I was before. But I nonetheless felt compelled to make this video, so there's evidently something there. The novel itself is very short. You could get through it quite quickly, or you could also experience it in its original format. When C.S. Lewis was putting together Out of the Silent Planet, he read each chapter aloud at meetings of the Inklings, his friend group at Oxford, which included, most notably, J.R.R. Tolkien. And the closest way to get that experience would be on audiobook. Now, there was a time when you could barely watch a YouTube video without having Audible shilled at you. I'm not sure if they're still blowing out their advertising budget on that anymore, but it's the end of the video. I can talk about whatever I want, so I'll undo some of that damage. Well, I guess first of all I should elaborate on what I mean. Audible, owned by Amazon, isn't exactly the greatest company out there. The controversy you're most likely to be aware of is the whole deal with royalties. When you buy a book off Audible, the cut that actually goes to the author is significantly below the industry average. The only way they get a higher rate is if they agree to make their audiobook exclusively available on Audible. This is usually a pretty good trade-off. Audible is the most popular audiobook platform by far, since it's the one that most people know about, due in part to them spamming all those YouTube sponsorships. So that extra cut is worth it, even if it means losing out on all the other platforms. But then, the more books that are exclusive to Audible, the more customers will subscribe there as opposed to other services. The larger their market share becomes, the further they'll be able to cut royalties because the authors are all out of other options. Now, in fairness, Audible has made updates to their model that are supposed to address the issue, but in most cases, if you actually do the math, it results in the authors getting less money than before. Daniel Green has been making several videos about it recently. It's a whole thing. There's currently a lawsuit going on against Amazon due to this whole model, so I guess we'll see how that shakes out. And then there's another lawsuit about false advertising, stemming from the fact that when you buy an audiobook on Audible, you don't actually own it. You get a license to listen to it, but there's all this digital rights management technology which is meant to prevent piracy, but also means that they can revoke that license at any time. You can pay for a book, but at any point they have the right to make it disappear if, say, it was caught up in some legal challenge or major controversy. So, for the sake of argument, let's assume you want to get away from all that. Well, first of all, obviously, there's lots of audiobooks that you can listen to for free. I've talked before about LibriVox, which has volunteer recordings of works which have fallen into the public domain. But relying on that has limitations. We can just look at Out of the Silent Planet. It was published 87 years ago. C.S. Lewis has been dead for 62 years, but his work is still under copyright in the US. It's in the public domain in some other countries, but LibriVox is based in the US, so they're unable to host any recordings of his work. Another option is Libby, which is a service you can sign up to with your local library card. It's not available in every country, and not every library is affiliated with it, but statistically, the vast majority of people watching this will have access to it. It's a fantastic service, but it also has some limitations. The catalog is pretty limited, and because it works like a library, there's a limited supply. If I want to check out of the Silent Planet, it looks like I'll have to wait a couple weeks. But again, both of these are free, you have nothing to lose by using them. But if you want a wider selection of audiobooks that you can listen to on demand, then that'll have to be a paid service. Authors and narrators need money as well, and as long as I'm confident that more of the money's going to them and less of it's going to Jeff Bezos, then that is more than fair. There's a few big Audible competitors out there, and they all have their own sales pitches, but the one I ended up switching to is Libro FM. It generally has a reputation as the most ethical player in the space. It's a certified B Corp. It lets you select a local bookstore that will actually get a portion of the money you pay. They don't have all that DRM nonsense, so you actually own what you buy. Now again, I'm not being paid to say this, so I accept that there might be some skeletons in the closet that I'm not aware of, but from everything I've looked into, I couldn't dig up anything. Their catalog is a bit more limited than Audible's, which makes sense since Audible has all those exclusivity deals, but it's still got enough there to last you a lifetime. And Libre FM also has authors like Cory Doctorow, who's taken all of his stuff off of Audible due to everything we've discussed. And to add on to it, their subscription rate is also cheaper than Audible's. I'll throw a link in the description. For transparency, this is not a sponsorship, but the link does contain a referral code. But if you do sign up, I don't get any actual money off of it. It just gives me a free credit to buy more books. I can recommend a couple of books I listened to while doing research for this video. With something like the Space Trilogy, it touches on so many different themes that there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down. Lots of stuff that I started reading up on that just didn't fit into the final script. One of these was More Everything Forever by Adam Becker. It's an exploration of the ideological fixations that occupy the Silicon Valley elite. AI, immortality, effective altruism, effective accelerationism, and explaining why most of them are complete nonsense. Insofar as the character of Weston serves as a warning for anything in the real world, I'd say he'd fit among that set pretty well. And when it comes to fiction, I think an interesting comparison for the Space Trilogy is Remembrance of Earth's Past by Liu Cixin. It's an epic sci-fi trilogy that, in many ways, is a throwback to old-time authors like H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapleton. It's a series that's not afraid to spend a lot of time going in depth to weird fringe science, or exploring big philosophical and sociological ideas. It also has a reputation for being, well, I guess some people might say, a little bit evil. It is, in many ways, the exact opposite of the Space Trilogy. It has this strong, unshakable faith in the potential of technological progress, and there's lots of aspects that people have interpreted as promoting militarism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. And if you read it, you'll definitely see that the books play around with those ideas quite a lot, but also includes a lot of complications to those ideas the further you get into it. It's the type of series that lends itself to multiple different interpretations, and on the whole, it won't be to everyone's taste, but it's become one of the best regarded science fiction series of the 21st century for a reason, and I definitely encourage people to check it out. But this video has gone on for long enough. Fun fact, my original plan was to have this whole Joel Haver rotoscoping thing go on for like half the video, but then I started recording and trying to do the edits and realized this whole thing is such a massive pain, I just couldn't do it. But yeah, until I see you next time, try not to commit interplanetary genocide.